This is a Manhattan-bound L train. The next stop is...
Good afternoon, ladies and germs. Welcome to the 7th episode of Bittersweet, Brooklyn. We are here less than 12 feet from the line that separates zip code 11211 from 11222. My name is Meredith Chesney. I'm here with my host, Dennis Farr, and our co-host, Danny Robo. Welcome.
So let's talk about Emily Badger's article.
Okay.
The Atlantic
Cities.
How many gentrification critics are actually gentrifiers themselves? As the article reads, if I'm got the right one, right?
I applaud Emily's article, but she's late in the game. This is one of those Cassandra moments where I was banging my head against the wall because very few people acknowledge that gentrification scholarship, especially on Williamsburg, scant as it was, often read as compromised. Compromised by its own participation. Even though this isn't gentrification scholarship, I'm going to refer to once going to a community board meeting, and I forgot this official. I really hate to say this about any human being, but it just struck me as so insignificant. And the reason why I thought he wouldn't be a person of significance was because how easily lulled he was by alcohol. Or at least that was the impression I got from him in this kind of snapshot reduction I'm probably making about
What do you mean lulled by alcohol?
But I remember that he was making a presentation, and the presentation was actually professional. It was he and a couple other people, and the details are somewhat vague to me because I didn't commit much of it to memory because I wasn't impressed. Even though the presentation was professional.
Was this somebody applying for a liquor license?
I think this was for the Greenway Initiative.
Okay.
And how it was going to manifest on West Street. And so he made reference to having a good time at the bars and like motion to some of the activists in the community board, and you know who we're talking about. I was immediately repulsed. I don't know how to explain it. Like my immediate reading of something that just would probably strike anyone else as insignificant. Like it just seemed to have such a type for me that I find so bothersome that relationships and development and plans in this neighborhood are...
Yeah, I think you're really underestimating though the power of the pull that New York City has had for decades on people from other places that come to New York to live, to go to school, to work, whatever, because it is perceived, as the city that never sleeps. There's constantly bars to go to. I know that many people, when they first move here, myself included, it's all about bar life and going out and spending time in bars. And so he's not alone.
Well, I don't underestimate it, Meredith. I know its power. I'm bothered by the choice.
Mm-hmm.
Misplaced power or misdirected power?
I really don't know how to express the hold that Tavern economy has on Williamsburg, but it's got a real hold. It's got a powerful hold. Mm-hmm. It's been disappointing, or at least for me, in the stock of like human beings that like frequent the area, and also in the decisions that they make about how the community is going to proceed and go onward.
It's definitely all consuming all this consumption. That's one of the little arguments I'll have a lot of with my husband's kids who live down in Jersey. They're in their late 20s now, and they kind of, when I start talking about how like it's so freaking annoying to be kept up every night by partiers screaming in the streets, and he'll ask me stuff like, well, why did you move to New York? With this assumption that like every neighborhood is Party Avenue, Party Central, and it was not that way here for the longest time. Now you see bars and restaurants springing up on what were forever residential streets, and we are supposed to absorb this somehow as like this is a normal part of the growth, and because alcohol is so well received in this neighborhood, I don't know. I think it's a huge problem, but
huge problem in the sense of in the social sense or in the economic sense in terms of what it actually brings into the neighborhood?
Well, so my argument would be when people always talk about like, oh, these businesses though, it's wonderful for the tax base. Here, for example, did we talk about this last week about the Parks Department and the Rockaways?
No.
So they've got, miles after mile of boardwalk ripped up, fucked up. The only place they spent the Parks Department spent their energy in the Rockaways was working on getting some concession stands opened for this newfound crowd of kids that go out there and are enjoying the beach. And a lot of people that are supporting this saying like, yeah, but look, look what it does for the tax base. That's great for the economy. It brings business, blah, blah, blah. What has this increased tax base given to us in Williamsburg and Greenpoint? Name one thing that increased revenue from business owners has done for this neighborhood. Call in now, call in next week, email me, name one. Name a traffic light that got installed because of it, or some new sewers, or some, transportation upgrades. Besides, it took years to add on a few extra runs on the L train. All this money, what did it get us? So I'm sorry, the argument that business is good for business is like, I don't know. Jury's still out for that on me. It's helping somebody, no doubt.
Right.
But who and where and why not us when it's at our expense?
I really think it comes to, and I can only comment from the idea of being a musician and playing shows growing up as a kid. Every time I ever did a show, and Dennis, you can vouch for this because you've been through it. You go to shows, the first thing you do when you deal with a promoter is, okay, how many people can you draw? Which is always the same question. How many people can you draw? Can you draw 50? Here's your tickets, here's your pre-sale, pay to play. But it always comes down to how many people you can bring in and how you can pop the bar. So my experience as far as doing these shows and playing out there, it's never about, from what I see, never about the actual culture. It's more about how many, and I'll use wrestling terminology, how many asses you can put in seats. Or in this case, how many asses you can put in seats in front of the bar.
That's not a wrestling terminology.
It's in carny terminology.
It's every day.
That's how I understood it.
That's every understanding. So let's go back to Emily Badger. So she's specifically talking about academia though, which is in fact, even though gentrification is the spirit of the college campus, it radiates out of the college campus, it's driving towards this deficient model of a college campus, which is why I mentioned the Tavern economy, because I myself, I don't have a problem with people, look, we're having drinks. I don't have a problem with people getting together having drinks.
We're having free drinks. I did not sell them.
It's virgin, we swear.
I just wonder when it's gonna stop though, when it's gonna move on, because I wonder if we've become shackled to this mentality. This has been a problem in Williamsburg, which is why sometimes you can go down streets and you find this in any neighborhood. People get fixed on a model and they're terrified, they don't want to break away from the model. Even the simple aesthetic of a brownstone. And you go down to Park Slope, everyone loves brownstones. Very few will mention the monotony of the appearance. Mm-hmm. And the same thing here, even though this is a vinyl siding, and Williamsburg is more curmudgeonly for me, but still very loving for me than it is the Radiant. That exists in another field. There isn't a lot of housing stock except maybe on South 5th Street, between Union and Rodney. Those are some nice places.
To me, the utilitarianism of the vinyl siding is the appeal and what it signifies. That this is working class Brooklyn. And if you don't like it, your tastes are too refined. You intellectuals, Dennis, with your high, lofty educations and refined elitist taste, shouldn't look down your nose at it.
Which are the arguments we in fact are making about the monstrosities that the one that's across the street.
Yeah.
In a sense, when we are talking about these kind of class distinctions, even these racial distinctions, we're talking about something else, something transcendent of all these categories that appeals in the heart to everyone who beholds, who comes to Williamsburg. Which is why Williamsburg is such a visited area now. Why people come from all over the world now here. People come because they want to be provoked in their hearts. That provocation is shackled. It's aborted actually by Tavern. There has to be something else.
Because that's all that's here though when they get here. And I'm not exactly sure how this is marketed to tourists. I know I see them, you know, when I go
Ass.
to Bedford. And,
It's marketed like ass.
Yeah.
There's a subtle.
but
It's
when
not
you
as
get here,
explicit.
there's
like-
no ass, but there's a place to get a drink. There's a lot of places to get a drink. What else is there after you've gone and done your thrift store clothing shopping? Those are the two things. There's two things I give directions to a lot. It is how to get, I'm not going to name brand names, how do I get to so-and-so vintage clothing place? There's a couple of those now. And then how do I get then to the brewery tour? How do I get to Brooklyn Brewery? And those are directions I give every day almost. You know, somebody stopping for that. So like I wonder, like, I mean, maybe these people are just coming for the beer and the used clothing.
The glamour of
mean-
it. It's
I mean, how much of the sociology and the history of Williamsburg is even put into the marketing to the tourists that come out here? Like, I think the marketing is really just all about this new stuff, the things that aren't Williamsburgy at all, but are now by proxy of how Brooklyn has been rebranded. So you have Smorgasburg and the Flea, and those being, you know, pools for big crowds of tourists and all. And what's there to do after that? I mean, I don't think they're coming out here going, oh, this is the borough of churches, but they're not out here doing the churches tour, because there isn't one of those, I don't think. Maybe there is. I don't know.
We should find out.
I mean, people drink. People like to drink.
Well, I mean, this comes back to the same Domino, the Domino Sugar, Jagualentus issue that we're all hurtling towards in the next couple of weeks. Has the alternative plan been released? Because last I checked, the Save Domino people had an alternative plan and wanted the public to consider it. And I haven't heard anything. I myself personally don't support the Save Domino group. I have my own personal reasons. And I also think that a lot of this is, as we've spoken about in terms of Smorgasburg, that a lot of this is competition for space, that it's not done really. Even though there's a characterization, every side is characterizing it as though they're performing a service to the world, utilitarian. Even Jagualentus, even though of course he's probably the most honest because he says, we expect a return on this property, he also talks about the kind of like redemptive value of this parcel. So who's telling the truth then? Who should the public throw its weight behind so that when it comes down to the nitty-gritty and fists have to fly and spaces have to be taken?
For me, that's easy though. For the right now, I have to put my weight behind Save Domino. I don't care what their alternative plan is. Anybody that wants to stop Jed Walentis and what he's doing, that's our first step. And if that happens, and we got to save ourselves from Save Domino down the line, then that's what happens. But right now, the immediate thing that has to be done is this project has to be stopped.
But we already know what the Save Domino people want. The point is, I know I'm not going to gain any new information by the revelation of this new plan. The details of their alternative are very well attested. They want a museum. They want to fashion it in the fashion of the Tate Modern in England. They want it to be a significant tourist draw, and they want any remaining parcels or marginal parcels or subsidiary parcels to be in their control as private artist studios. I don't support that.
Yeah.
This is a group that has demonstrated antagonism towards affordable housing.
Oh, really?
Oh, absolutely. I first connected with them under the pretense that we were both critical of NAG. Because they were critical of NAG, and I was also critical of NAG at the very beginning, but our reasons were very different. They were critical of NAG because NAG was a affordable housing advocate, ostensible as that may be, whatever NAG's real mission
Did you
is.
say laughable as that may be?
Meredith is
You
saying
don't
that.
have to edit that. I don't give a fuck.
That's fine by me.
Meredith, you're my hero.
I'll give you another anecdote, okay, that was telling for me. I remember when we were in front of the City Planning Commission and everyone was coming in, and it was really a circus-like atmosphere. There were many people in these Domino Yes shirts, yellow. It was really kind of shameful, really. And I would go to some of them and talk to some of the people who were the pro-CPC camp and asked them, why are you doing this? Why are you supporting this multinational developer who is a principal of gentrification, who clearly wants to displace you? Why are you involved? Why are you in bed with him? You know, and it was many of the responses were interesting. One of the responses was they thought the project would eventually fail and it would have to be handed over to the poor. Which is kind of romantic, but I thought it was kind of also beautiful.
That's a wonderful thought to have. I mean, can they justify it though? I mean, that just seems like something.
Well, they were right. In fact, their prognostication was accurate because CPC then went into default on the property, or it owed money, and so it eventually sold the property. So to a cool $1.5 million. And so they did very well selling the property to Jed Walentis.
That was their profit, was $1.5 million.
No, not $1.5 million. I'm sorry. It was I think it was like $168 million.
Profit.
Right.
Oh wow.
Right. But I don't know that for certain. But Brian mentioned it in our second episode. So all we have to do is just rewind that episode, and he mentions how. But they did very well. They rescued the CPC, in fact. But the other observation that was made by these people, and it was also my observation, was how dubious the relationships were between the parties that were supposedly in opposition with each other. Because there you had the people who were in the so-called Williamsburg Independents exchanging their cards and trying to solicit work from CPC. They were trying to build these professional relationships. And they were very chummy and civil and shaking hands and hugging and, you know, kissing on the cheek and knowing each other. Instead of pouring scorn on them, instead they were pouring their scorn on the people who were poor, who didn't even know how to speak. Many of them were old school, didn't even speak English. It is true, many of them were bussed in, but they were bussed in because they were passionate about what their presentation that was made to them through their churches, however deficient we may view that to be. Nevertheless, they were there independently of their own agency. They weren't like drugged and brought there, even though that was often the characterization made. That these were people who didn't even know what was going on. No, they knew that there was affordable housing afoot, and they were going to get their hands on some, and get their hands on some for the rest of the community. That was definitely not on the mind of the people in the Williamsburg Independents and all the other groups, subsidiary, whatever, ephemeral personalities who were coming in and out. There were some people obviously sincere, obviously. There were some people you wondered though how much of this was entertainment.
Oh yeah, I was at a lot of those community board meetings, and there was tons of eye rolling when you would see the older Hispanics coming in and sitting with their t-shirts and signs and ready and everything, and Zid Esteban and yelling and everything, and you know, there was plenty of sideways glances and chagrin.
You can disagree. I mean, I'm passionate. I'm passionate in disagreement with the rest of the community, with Esteban about his former position, even though his position is modified and more complex. But I never once had the impression that I was dealing with inferior stock, people who couldn't make up their own mind and were being led astray by their pastors and their congregations. Or that these were people who didn't understand the variables because it was just too complex for them, or a lot of the language that was often being used to demean them. Again, the parties that were supposed to be in opposition were so much more friendly. So much more friendly. Like you see CPC executives totally chumming it up with community board members and all these people who were supposed to be in opposition to them. That's why I don't support this plan. Because that's why I believe the alternative plan hasn't been released to the public. Because it won't survive scrutiny. It will not.
You very well may be right. And as you see, my Save Domino poster splattered everywhere. This is just that 11th hour desperate. Just please, God, make it stop. Make something happen.
I think that the best way to do it is to invite.
Start over.
I'm sorry, Meredith. Please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. That's just it. You know, there's nothing more to it than like I don't know what the right thing is yet. I don't think any of us know what the right thing is yet. But I know this is the wrong project, and that's as far as it goes. You know, and that is why I would still chain myself to a building to keep that first.
And I'll be there with you.
You know,
I
the
got your
wrecking
back.
ball. But you know, it doesn't go further than just stopping this plan for me personally. So I'll wear my T-shirt and put up my posters and take pictures and put them on Instagram and beg Lena Dunham and Scott Stringer and anybody, Zach Galifianakis, whoever will fucking listen, you know, to just, let's just stop this plan and slow the fuck down. We need to start over again. This isn't the one.
Meredith, what do you say to the people who argue that the process has slowed down already enough and that that parcel has laid fallow, so to speak, for so many years?
Well, what's to gain by getting in a big hurry to do something when there's no transportation infrastructure yet to just support, you know, that many new people in the area? You know, they're claiming that the office space that they're going to build is going to house like 5,000 workers or whatever. You know, how are those people going to get to work? And then they are citing evidence from the Vice magazine publishing people saying like, well, like half of those people, they're going to live in the neighborhood anyway. It's like, excuse me, I know what you pay your employees. They're not going to be working in this neighborhood. Your employees, you know, I know your employees. I know what kind of money they make. I know they won't be they do not live in this neighborhood by far and large. And the ones that do are living, you know, 5 and 6 deep in the frat house, crash pad
Or on the margins
scenario.
of the geography.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's all a load of shit.
Do you know any of these punk bands, Meredith? Like 77 and Casualties. They seem to be. They style themselves as a 77. Well, maybe Casualties are chaos punk.
By uniform.
More.
Yeah.
More. And then there are these 77 style bands. Do you remember any of that? It's only a category within the larger umbrella of punk rock, but they themselves believe they are the umbrella of punk rock.
I don't know anything about that.
It tends to happen with punk.
Vein, yeah.
Right? Because there's so many veins, but each vein thinks it's an artery. You know? Right?
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Every vein thinks it's an artery.
They were pretty important in the late stages of the gentrification of the Lower East Side when we spent all our time on St. Mark's Place. Right? From 3rd Avenue to Avenue A. And then some occasionally beyond where it wasn't even like any semblance of punk rock at all.
That stretch, that whole stretch, St. Mark's Place from 3rd Ave, really that block between 3rd Ave and 2nd. I remember the Freaks, the t-shirt shop was like the headquarters. And
right.
I just hung
And there was
right
Trash
there.
Vaudeville.
Mm-hmm. Trash Vaudeville, absolutely. What is it? The bars too. What is the? I remember. What is it? There was a bar. It was a Bull McCabe's. No, but Bull McCabe's. Was it Bull McCabe's?
I don't remember any of the names of any of the bars. It was never even worth the sell of memory.
The only reason I remember Bull McCabe's is because I only went in there once. It was the most uncomfortable experience of my life, and I'm not shit talking. This is 100% true because I love the Templars. They're one of my favorite bands. I walked in and I went up to, I think it was Phil, I want to say, and I said,
The drummer.
Okay, yeah. I said, dude, I love your band. You're inspirational to me, and I got nothing. They just looked at me like, what are you doing here? And of course I'm thinking like I'm a dipshit kid, and of course I don't belong there. But it was like kind of an uncomfortable feeling, you know?
I'd love to talk about that, Meredith. I know that you spent a lot of time in the Lower East Side also. I'd love to talk about the relationship that we had to the Lower East Side against the relationship we have here in Williamsburg. As punks, we thought we were the most marginalized group in the universe, but we were agents of gentrification in the Lower East Side.
Yeah.
And there's such a false consciousness. Back then, when I was a part of the punk scene, I'm imagining that even punks now could never comprehend themselves as agents of gentrification, but that's exactly what we were.
I don't know. I think there must have been it wasn't pure naivete. I know that for me, explicitly, we just celebrated, or I don't know if celebrate is the best choice of the word, the 25-year anniversary of the Tompkins Parks riots. And I remember very clearly, I'd only, lived here a year or so, and it was like first long hot summer, and while all that was going on, and though many of my friends were involved, were activists, and were really demonstrating. They were right there in their face. I was one of the dilettantes on the sideline, literally with a bottle of Veuve Clicquot in a brown paper bag, sitting on a stoop, drinking my own bottle of champagne while my girlfriend had hers, my boyfriend. We all had a bottle of champagne in a brown paper bag, and we're just watching, often instigating, though, trying to provoke the cops. We would, because they had those telecommunication vans set up there at like A and 9th Street. I think one was parked there for months and months and months. And just, glaring and saying stuff and really like getting excited, that something was happening. And it really, I think I was really perched on some ridiculous place of somehow feeling like, I think I did have an awareness of that I was an interloper, I was an outsider, I was a gentrifier, and somehow I thought that because of my privilege and position, being here as a college student at New York University, going to film school, that somehow that I was a neutral entity because I looked like a punk rock kid and I lived in a shithole and I didn't have a lot of money that I was spending on rent or food or anything because it was all going to NYU, that somehow my effect was somehow neutral on my environment. And I was so wrong, and there were so many of us whose presence, it wasn't neutral at all. And I think we really thought that we were neutral because we didn't feel like bourgeois entities coming in and demanding that there be fancy restaurants and fancy cafes and spending a lot of money in those places. Our presence did help pave the way, to start seeing Chez Rue, La La, whatever, on Avenue C by the 90s.
The riots were sparked by people from the neighborhood calling the police in. So it was people from the neighborhood wanted something to be done about so-called undesirables in the park. There's so many fascinating parallels, even though we know, of course, the McCarren Park is unique and it's in a unique situation. But if we observe like this, the Tompkins Square riot in 1988.
But was it old timers calling the cops, or was it new residents calling the cops?
The most prominent players in the riots, the most prominent rioters and the most prominent face in media were people who weren't from the neighborhood. It's interesting that much of the account and narrative that we get about the riot is absent or silent this narrative, the people from the neighborhood and what they wanted. There's mention of the community divisions, but mention of the community divisions is used to dismiss any kind of real deep exploration. So, how did the community feel? Well, the community was divided. Okay, fair enough.
Okay, now Dennis, how much of that do you think is by design, though? Like in terms of how much of it was manufactured for that reason, that you get faces that are not indigenous to the area making comments about an area like that?
Well, it's in the process of gentrification. I think it's definitely embedded in the machine. If, for example, a similar situation, let's say a riot broke out in McCarren Park, it's always a possibility because of the pool, with the police presence there. If a riot broke out in McCarren Park pool, I think much of the narrative would be dominated by people who are not from the neighborhood, which is in fact what tended to happen when we were having troubles last year and our smaller troubles this year. You get reporting from Elle Magazine, Gothamist, DNA Info. A lot of these people think they are from the neighborhood. In fact, if you told them that they were interloper or they had this kind of perspective that may be in fact external or alien, they would be furious. I think you have a self-consciousness very few people have, Meredith, because the punks that I talk to, whenever we spoke about the paradoxical nature of being a punk rock, like being an anarchist and using anarchy as a shield to be an asshole sometimes, or to be right-wing, in fact, because most of the anarchists I knew were right-wing. Most of the anarchists I knew wanted anarchy so that way they could be shielded from any observation of their exploitation of other people. So if you said, hey, you can't do that, hey, I'm an anarchist, we don't accept instruction from other people. I'm really simplifying it, but I'm only doing it for the discussion, and I recognize the complexity of the history of anarchism. I should know, I study religion. Anarchism has a deep role in religion. Very few people, again, just like the punks in the Lower East Side, of which Danny and myself come from, refuse to acknowledge. Even to this day, if you spoke to any of the old school punks, and said, hey, we were ephemeral consumers. We were the most transient of the agents of gentrification. Who the fuck are we to dye our hair and tattoo ourselves and pretend that we are anything but? They would be mortified. They would be shocked. No, not me, no way. While I was there, I was always troubled by that because, I had no I knew a couple of people in the Lower East Side, but I had no lasting relationship or connection to the community there, even though I spent so much time there. I spent so much time there. but I rarely slept there, even when I was staying over someone's residence. That for me is the epitome of what a hipster is in Williamsburg.
And in my relationship to the two different neighborhoods, because I did live there for a good number of years in the Lower East Side, and I think that that's when I was a child in New York, I feel like in many ways. And when I crossed the river, when I came over here, that's when I decided to grow up. That's when it was just time for I didn't need to be in a bar every night, and hanging out every night. And I didn't. I laugh all the time. I had to explain to somebody the other day what FOMO is again, fear of missing out. And I think many newcomers to New York, you get that sense of you got to go out every night, and you get ready and you go out every night, and you wouldn't go out till midnight, but you stay out all night and you go out partying. And I got to that point, I think I was almost 30. It was age starts to catch up with you. You got to face reality.
Maybe you feel something wrong. Maybe you feel something inside that's wrong.
Well, I was never a trust fund kid. I have not been on my parents' payroll for an incredibly long time. And things are a little different. The reports came out the other day, 31% of millennials are still living in their parents' home nationwide. That's a huge number. We get a lot of shit. We read in the Brooklyn paper, and one of the big slams that people are always given, the Die hipster people, and a couple of those is that they're living you're living in your grandmother's basement. And and it's that's true everywhere. There's a lot of that. A lot of people are having to live at home still.
It shows the isolation of and alienation of American culture that we would actually use that as a slam on someone. And they live with their parents and their elders.
Yes, that it's a moral judgment as opposed to an economic function.
Right.
I know. When historically in this neighborhood, for three generations would live in the same home, or you would buy two buildings next door to each other. There was no shame in that you lived next door to your sister, and that your mother lived upstairs, your grandparents lived, and now that's an insult. It's disgusting, really, to me. It really speaks to the degrading of just the family unit and how we respect our elders, how we see ourselves within.
Do you think that's part part-way detachment, as far as a detachment that's inspired? Because to me it seems I'm one of those people that fall under that umbrella. I do, and it's because New York as a city. Let's take Williamsburg, or let's take the Lower East Side, or whatever have you. As far as rents are concerned, it's been made impossible to live on your own. Let's face it, I'm a $600 a week guy. I don't know if you want to take that out of post, whatever, but I'm a union guy. I work a job like anyone else. And I'm sorry, $2,000 a month does not begin to cover a 5-room railroad apartment in Ridgewood. Okay? And Ridgewood is not, from what I've seen, exorbitant just yet. But it's getting there. So, in terms of having to live at home and take care of the family unit, to me it seems like it's a detachment issue. It's the idea of, okay, you can do this on your own, you can make your own money, you can do this, you can do it, but you have to do it on your own. It has to be, and not to take a shit on D.I.Y, but it's still the idea.
There is no such thing. I want to emphasize that there is no such thing. No person, no agent of gentrification comes up and has pulled themselves up from bootstraps in this neighborhood. There's no such thing. There's always been some government or institutional support behind them, some familial structure. No matter how the physical distance is almost meaningless, especially in a world of mobile connectivity. To suggest that because you live 5 states away from your parents that somehow they're not supporting you or helping you is just preposterous. I'm not referring to the trust fund caricature. It's such a myth in Williamsburg. It's Ayn Randian. It's this idea people have in their minds that they're all John Galt, and that Williamsburg is some kind of Galt's Gulch. It's just preposterous. With my own eyes, I've seen agents of gentrification request something like a light in an intersection and have it instantly done, regardless of their complaints about bureaucracy, where for decades in the same area you've had Puerto Ricans and blacks suffering murders, suffering darkness, and never ever it being considered. So this idea that I'm sorry I'm belaboring it and I'm being emphatic, but it's amazing to me that people won't, it seems to shine through in the war on brunch issue. You know, when you read a lot of the comments and the impressions that people have about the possibility that they're going to be denied alcohol before noon on Sundays, and that somehow by being denied alcohol, their brunch is marred, and this is just the worst thing in the entire multiverse. I mean, Satan couldn't suffer a worse indignity. That's the impression you get. You're reading this, you're just like, wow, you know, this. I don't endorse violence, but some of these people need a slap in the face. You know? It's coming.
Well, somebody almost got slapped in the green market today over choice of language, and I think how it was put to them in the end was, well, you just got Brooklyn schooling, my friend. You know.
My best friend Charles, he just in passing one day tells me, and this is about this subject, and I'll never forget. He just looks at me, funniest kid in the world, just turns around, hauls off, and says, "Sometimes people just don't know when they can get fucked up."
Yeah.
Based on behavior.
Yeah.
Simple behavior.
Yeah.
You know, like little things. You know.
And it is strange that you see, you know, so many of the people that I kind of get annoyed with in the neighborhood are ones that probably more predisposed to have had like great educations and possibly even more solid home lives, definitely more funding for stuff that would have even inclusive of sports and activities in school where you learn a lot of skills on how to get along with other people, and you set these people loose on the street and they don't really know how to behave, and if they're called out on their behaviors that are self-indulgent or selfish, instead of just saying I'm sorry and correcting that behavior, that they will put up a fight. That hence the Brooklyn schooling that a person in the green market got today at the behest of my husband. It's interesting stuff how people really do feel, though. I think basically it comes down to money entitles you, you know, just to certain privilege.
I have another question. How much of it do you think comes back to like a locals only mentality?
Well, there's definitely that undercurrent, I think.
There's
I think the
definitely
hostility that my husband projects onto the community is definitely of like, you know, he's a Jersey City boy. They're a little bit, somewhat synonymous in many ways when you think about, you know, outer boroughs and communities, socioeconomic groups and whatnot. He's you know, he's a local as far as it goes. And I think that a lot of these things that play out very much come down to, you know, old schooler versus newcomer, and the newcomer's desire to insinuate his mores onto a community. There will be trouble over that stuff.
Just like like Dennis was mentioning, as far as like it being something that's, would you say it's inevitable? Something like that heating up beneath the surface and just
Warriors, warriors.
Every time I think about this, I think of Do the Right Thing. I always think of Mookie putting the trash can through the pizza shop window, and it's a scary thought because you're right. I personally think you guys are right. You know, living in Ridgecrest, I'm not from Williamsburg. I can only go on what you guys tell me in local politics and what I read in papers and on the internet. But living in Ridgewood and coming from Bushwick, what I encounter a lot of with a lot of my friends personally is this anti-hipster sentiment. And there are times where it gets ugly, really ugly. So to the point where I've never seen it go anywhere past conversation exactly. It never gets past words, but it's something where, I'll give you a perfect example. I was watching some YouTube video about, there was this situation on the 6 train specifically. And it bothered me only because this was a dude. I don't know if he was Hispanic or white or what his designation was, but he seemed local. You know, the vernacular seemed local. And there was some woman sitting down, and he kept calling her Ohio. He kept up with this whole, you don't belong here, Ohio, and all this stuff. And I'm pretty sure if I reference this, I'll give you guys a link for the video. But that bothered me because it's like, okay, you're assuming by sheer judgment, just by sheer visual, that this person is, in this person's terminology, a gentrifier. Because clearly you're assuming that this person is not from here, is not from New York, so they came in with their money, you know, took over something that you figured was yours, you know, which I'm not of the mind of the opinion that any of this really belongs to anyone. but it's just the idea that you're not digging deep enough. You're not digging deep enough into the idea that, I mean, I don't know if maybe I'm misquoting you, but like, it's not always like that. It's just not always like that. You can't judge a person by...
Well, what if they were from Ohio?
Well, if they were, they were, but it doesn't make any, to me, it doesn't make any statement on what their financial class is or what their statement is on tavern economy or how they feel about it. I mean, this could be a person who raises their child quietly and
We're not allowed to be inhospitable, right?
Right.
But at the same time, if the fact that they are from Ohio coming into New York, nevertheless, there is a character of the gentleman's observation is illegitimate because it's self-indulgent,
Right.
which is what he's accusing Ohio of. But his observation that Ohio is an alien and possibly transient perspective is valid. We've spoken all the time about how much damage is done to the community by people who don't spend a lot of time here. In fact, never intend to spend a lot of time here, who do see Williamsburg as a station instead of a stop. We've even spoken to Wilentes in the last episode when Hoffman and Letkus present. We spoke to the fact that Wilentes likely doesn't live in Williamsburg. Because if he lived in Williamsburg, he wouldn't propose such a bombastic plan, such a devastating...
Unless he's ambitious.
Well, I mean...
Like super ambitious.
I don't know if I would call that ambition. I think it would be a matter of context, you know.
Playing to the least common denominator.
I think like if you compare him to the previous plan, which is what he in fact is doing and what Two Trees is doing, of course he comes across as brilliant, but that's not the yardstick we want. That's not the yardstick I think I've ever, or anyone has ever wanted for Williamsburg. So people in Williamsburg are not anti-development. They're anti-gentrification. And so if they're anti-gentrification, they're anti-displacement. And this is the root of this gentleman's observation about this woman being from Ohio. Doesn't mean that he has the right, though, to interrogate her in that fashion. No, of course not. Not at all. There is a legitimacy to observing that this person, again, is coming from an external environment to likely impose, which is natural, by the way. So it's not something that's necessarily conscious. You know, you don't necessarily are conscious of the place that you are taking with every step that you take.
Right.
Right? But you are in fact taking it because for every placement there's a corresponding displacement. How do we break that formula? Because Williamsburg is big enough for everyone. Williamsburg is big enough for that dude who's inhospitable, and it's also big enough for that person from Ohio who wants to come here and put roots into the ground. Right? So there has to be a third way. It has to be a way that's not nativist, where we talk about locals asserting themselves in this really destructive, even self-destructive fashion. Totally inhospitable, intolerant of visitors and people who don't look like them, and in fact are wrong and guilty because they can't themselves use they themselves as any kind of yardsticks for anything, because any kind of soul searching or revelation of the self is going to reveal this transient character that we all are a part of.
I think so many of those people, though, now too, like my husband in particular, are that, you know, we're under extreme duress in this situation. You know, I think that if this would be played out over a much longer curve, you really wouldn't see this type of hostility from the nativist point of view of people finally being like, I've had it fucking enough and I'm gonna fucking say something.
We invited it in.
Like my husband yesterday on Havemeyer, he's been working down the hipster bike shop down on Havemeyer, which he built for that guy like 10 years ago. Great guy, wonderful, lovely family. The guy knows everybody on that block. He knows Norberto next door and all the people on the block that are fixtures. And yesterday, for whatever reason, they decided to start fucking with a kid who was walking down the street. Not harsh, but playing with him a little. And it was a guy, as my husband described it, I didn't see this with my own eyes. It's a guy with a beefy little guy, super hairy legs, wearing a skirt with horizontal stripes and wearing a top with vertical stripes. So Norberto and my husband and a couple other guys they're working with want to have a little fun with him. And nothing particularly cruel other than to point out how much these stripes clash. Dude, if you're gonna wear the stripes, can't they all go in the same direction? They don't say shit about him wearing a skirt, you know, you know, and the super crazy hairy legs, you know, walking down Havemeyer.
It sounds courageous to me.
And it's, you know, and so they mess with them a little, you know, about these clashing stripes or whatever, and it didn't get vulgar, and it didn't get super duper hostile or anything like that, but, you know, they said something, and they expressed that, and I think, you know, my husband told the story, and he was kind of proud of himself, you know, and this is a daily occurrence in my household. You know, there's a lot of tension over what's happening in this neighborhood, in my home, because we talk about it a lot. I have a lot of feelings about it, and I think it's actually like I can't see people not expressing stuff when there's outbursts on the trains about Ohio, you know, but because this is so unnatural. I think that everything that's happening in this neighborhood, you know, historically, we've had a section of town forever and ever, you know, earlier than the 1960s, the West Village was the freak zone, where anything goes, and when you wear what you want, you could be what you want to be, and you went to the village to do that, and sort of that village mentality has spread and spread and spread to the point where Williamsburg is sort of the East Village, the village across the river or whatever in many ways, in terms of the culture,
well, that was a joke,
the Bohemian culture. And
back then it was called Bedford Avenue, it was called Avenue E.
Avenue E, exactly, right. That's right. And you know, some pushback to that that's normal too, you know, so I can't totally hate on people that actually speak their mind about it if they're doing it in a way that's non-violent. You know, it's not hurting anybody to speak your mind.
I mean, I've had outbursts on the train. I sympathize with this gentleman personally. I've been on the L train, crowded train, and even if there are very few words spoken, there's a complex paralanguage going on between people. And I've had moments where I've told people to go fuck themselves and tell them how, in a snapshot, maybe they didn't deserve it, but like how they were ruining my neighborhood and ruining my community, and how selfish they were, and how their vanity was undeserved.
I guess so much of it is like feeling like it's not that people come in from outside, it is that they don't want to integrate into sort of the patterns that were here before, in the most simplistic terms of like how to walk down the sidewalk and how you keep to the right. Or
for them, integration means capitulation. Again, like the idea of the nativist. So it's like, oh, we've got to come here and we've got to be like everyone else. We've got to have a vinyl sided house. Behave like, you know, we stick our hands in our pants or something like that, which is not what's asked for. What we are asking for is that we do proceed, we do grow. But I agree, there is this sense, and it's almost palpable, of imposition of values, an imposition of will that is irksome to people.
Well, that whole notion with the newcomers doing the whole, there was nothing here.
Right.
So they're not even being transformative, they're being creationist. You know, they've actually made something out of nothing, which is bullshit. They may have turned something into something else, but nobody in a very, very long time has made something out of nothing in New York.
Well, I had a conversation with Ethan about this, you know that, right? I had a conversation with him about what was called creation ex nihilo and creation ex materia, which are concepts. They're philosophic concepts, but the Catholic Church is also obviously focused on it. This idea of creation out of nothing or creation out of something. The same arguments came up when we talked about how gentrification narrative will often say, first it'll say the area was vacant or it was a wilderness, so it's a modification of this creation out of nothing. There is something there though, but it's wild. So they've extracted order out of this chaos.
So do you think that they're actually trying to suggest taming rather than
I think it's a way to deny what was there. It's a way to just shut the door that any person, any unique individual.
Because that
was
wildness,
there.
I agree with Meredith, because that wildness is valued. It's how they authenticate themselves. The agents of gentrification authenticate themselves by portraying their previous lives in the neighborhood as wild, or having a certain kind of wildness and freedom. But they don't, I agree with Meredith, they don't want to see it in any other entity. And it doesn't matter if there's any other entity. In fact, there is no other entity, because there's nothing there before that. But in the beginning, it was wild.
It's much less painful. Because, at the root of that, if you really admit what really went on, you'll have to admit that people, individuals have been displaced by this. And the second you acknowledge that, that opens up a whole world of the reality of what it's done. And there's so many people that do not want to face that. They will go to their grave saying nothing was there. And so it's really easy for when people will write about things like the North Side Piers going up. They feel so good about that because literally that lot was an abandoned property. That was one of them that actually was closed and there's nothing going on. Now you can't say that about across the street and you can't say that about next door, but the myth gets to expand as if there was this vast territory of wilderness that was all abandoned and spooky and
Well, this
the
colonial,
dead bodies,
right.
you know.
This thing that Lekis mentioned last week as the colonial mindset, which I agree with. I've also in fact used that term, but I also connect more intimately with what we were talking about earlier in the episode with SRA, Satanic Ritual Abuse, and the alien abduction reports that are from 1947. They're not 1947 because the first abduction was not in 1947, but I think in mid-1950s. But nevertheless, how there is an absence of forensic evidence, and the presentation of the absence of forensic evidence only intensifies and entrenches the perspective. So like if you tell people, no, there was something here before Ukraine, they expend all calorie and energy and mind power possible to prove to you that either there was nothing here before or that anything that existed before was but demon. Nothing but demons. That's it. And there was nothing else.
I wanted actually expound, if I'm using that word correctly, on the point that Meredith had made earlier as far as the shifting from the Lower East Side to Williamsburg and the idea of tavern economy and how it trickles over. The motion of it going from the Lower East Side through Williamsburg and then creeping its way up into Bushwick and into North Williamsburg and then to Ridgewood eventually. As far as tavern economies and that detachment, can we edit that? I completely lost my point.
Yeah.
I had it.
Take two.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to get my point back. So.
It'll come to you.
Yeah, it'll come to me and I'll.
I mean, it's a distinctly it's a distinctly westward migration.
Yes.
Right?
Okay. Right.
No. I take that back. It's a distinctly eastward migration. But are we suggesting that like there was some kind of uncanny and unique force in the village that spontaneously materialized as some kind of energy that's shared by multiple people across multiple lifespans that is now migrating eastward and has found itself in Williamsburg and also Bushwick? I don't know.
It's the path of least resistance. Opening a bar is one of the easiest freaking things to do in business.
But the tavern economy is only a remnant of the gentrification. It's only a part. Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, I mean, what besides coffee shops and bars? What's left besides the coffee shops and bars that have really profoundly changed? And I mean, when I say bars, I mean restaurants and bars. When I say coffee shops, I mean all the cafes and coffee shops.
What do you say then to people like Ethan, who would argue that you're excluding the warehouse events, which he would definitely place under the
whole
umbrella of
immersions,
gentrification?
the whole scene. Well, the scenes within the scene, I mean, that is definitely a whole different hierarchical process that goes on within there. But I wouldn't even begin to understand or know where to pick that apart other than I think it's outsiders find collectives because they are outsiders. If we live in a truly inclusive society where you can make your art and do whatever you want in a free society, we'd be doing it everywhere. I think that just that's vindication that their own self-awareness as outsiders, that they had to form collectives, as sort of collectivism, sort of society of artists within the warehouse culture. There's the rave culture, the Rubalot culture that went on. I played around in some of that, played around with some Leary people. Hello, Leary. I know some of that world, Because I'm a girl that likes to have fun.
Something has to be said about the fact that the one remnant that endures in all that performance, all that category that was going on were the Beer Olympics. You remember the Beer Olympics? This was the mid-1990s, and many people argue that the Beer Olympics...
But they still do this. They still do this.
Right.
Brooklyn Brewery is a part of...
Right.
They do immersion,
Right.
immersion LIC. They did an immersion Kiwanis. They've done... They're still doing it. And it's now... But it's really... It's a beer tasting kind of thing in the neighborhood. It doesn't have that underground... artsy, dark, kind of spooky.
Right. The first
thing
Beer
going
Olympics
on.
in the neighborhood was
purely, consumer culture stuff.
Yeah, the first Beer Olympics was a couple of years after the radioactive bodega event, and it was trying to mimic the radioactive bodega event, but it had none of the substance, but it just had the trappings, and it had like the bands. It was like 2-3 day festival, 20-30 bands. And they called it Beer Olympics because they sold you a cup and you went and you got drunk out of your mind. It wasn't like you were doing any beer tasting.
Yeah.
You were guzzling beer. And it was much more a matter of physical endurance. And then later on, Brooklyn Brewery got involved. And it became much more so what you're describing. First Beer Olympics was a liminal event. Somewhere between the artist events and then this Tavern economy. It's the missing link. Like you said, they still do the Beer Olympics, but I'm talking about the very, very first Beer Olympics when it was like all punk and alternative bands. Back when I think this label alternative was even being used, even though it fits.
That's clear. I mean, commerce is going to grab onto anything that's cool and fucking ruin it, though, for everybody. I mean, this is how Williamsburg got ruined. It really wasn't, this wasn't planned on paper by developers. They take a look-see, a wait-see what's happening everywhere, and they're gonna follow the trends, and they're gonna be opportunists and take advantage of it. My argument would have been, though, that there were steps that we could have taken along the way, whether it be through media, through the groups that represent us, through activism, on the community board level, to have been more aware of what this stuff means, how things are covered, how things are talked about, how things are reported, what's important, what's not important. Why I got so pissed off reading that thing in Brooklyn Magazine whining that some 52-year-old woman dared to move into one of they're outraged right now because the people buying in the glass towers are not young, hip people.
Right.
They're post-menopausal, baby boomer people moving in. And there was some outrage about there. I don't know if outrage is the best word, but there were shocks, that older people, baby boomers, are the ones that are buying some of these units. And it is interesting, I think maybe it was 5 years ago when Warehouse 11 opened up. I love to go to these open houses. I check everything out, look at all the brochures and stuff, and 5 years ago even I'd go to these open houses, and lots of times with the young people and the young couples looking at units, you would see other middle-aged people with them, and you got a clear sense of these are the parents, and these are probably the parents that might be bankrolling some of this stuff. When I went to the 101 Bedford thing last week, there were a lot of 50-something people there as well. And I guess I realize now after the fact, these 50-something people that were there, those aren't the parents of the kids that are gonna be living there necessarily. These might be buyers and renters themselves. And I think it sort of collectively dawned on, Brooklyn Magazine, oh my God, these are people that have worked really hard and saved all their money and they've sold their house wherever to come and live in Williamsburg. And I think it's really hypocritical on many levels for people to be upset. All of a sudden they have to clearly define who's okay and who's not okay. It's like if you're in your 30s and you're a good looking young couple or whatever, that's cool. But if you're in your 50s...
Right, you suit the look of the neighborhood.
Yeah, which is so pretentious
look in the role.
and bullshitty because they don't belong either.
Well, it's also ageist, and it's also a fascinating inversion of the accusation that was made by them against older people in the neighborhood. They were criticizing as
being old
that they were
fogies.
being old fogies, and that they were being targeted because they were targeted by agists. which is just another fascinating inversion. The problem with people like Virginia Smith and L/Brooklyn Magazine is that they don't seem to see that they're still demonizing people. They're still demonizing people who aren't them.
Mm-hmm. Well, they do it both ways too. Us oldsters, we're jealous of the young hipster, and now us oldsters, we're the bad guys because we're the ones buying the new condos.
Right.
And it's like, really, what did you think was going to happen? Seriously, like this is the
Or that
natural.
they would never get old themselves.
No, they're not going to
never
get
age.
old. They're not going to get old.
Good luck. Good luck with that perception. I'll be calling you 20 years from now.
Well, they should be glad, actually, because maybe if mommy, daddy buy one of those condos, maybe they'll get sick of it in 5 years. And then they'll inherit it, or get to buy it for $1 or whatever.
Well, that's likely going to happen because how can a family be raised, really, in this place of such increasingly crowded spaces? You know?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if they get depressed, they can go to the bar.